Wow. Well, thank you. I have to say that's one of the nicer introductions I've received. A four-person introduction, so that's great. I also want to actually thank the Public Policy Institute for hosting this great event. I think I've done maybe 10 of these now for different clubs throughout the country, and this has to be one of the nicest venues I've done. And to be honest, it's probably the best turnout I've had. So this is just a great event. So thanks for setting it up. So as the title suggests, tonight I'll be talking about our nation's finances. Okay. And these issues have been in the news a lot recently, right? There's been the whole discussion of the government shutdown. There's been I think we've had now 2 or 3 different incidents where the nation has hit up against its debt ceiling, and we've had to have a debate over whether to extend that debt ceiling. Those issues and those debates are really short-run issues. Okay, they're kind of, they come and they go, and what I want to focus on tonight is really the long-term picture for our nation's finances. It's kind of a gloomy talk. Maybe I should take a 2-minute pause. Everyone wants to go grab another drink. But it's an important talk, right? There's hardly, it's hard to think of many other things that are more important than kind of understanding what it's going to take to get our country back on a solid footing in terms of its budget. So I was at a conference maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, and it was an international conference, and there was a speaker, I think he was from Singapore, and he made this observation that I had never really taken note of, but he said that apparently Americans like to start presentations like this with a joke. So I'm gonna be true to form. This is what our talk tonight will be about. For good humor, of course, you need just the right element of truth, right? You need a little bit of truth, but you need, I'm not sure this is very funny, actually, because there's a little bit too much truth in it, right? So obviously it shows that the U.S. budget deficit is just kind of out of control. And that's been true probably for the last 4 or 5 years. And as I said a few moments ago, that wouldn't be that big of a problem if it were a short-run situation, right? We just went through a really severe economic downturn. We've experienced several wars recently. And so you might think, well, those are short-run situations, and once those difficulties subside, the fiscal picture will recover. But unfortunately, as we're going to see tonight, that's not the case. That really the problems that we face are much longer term in nature. And so what I want to talk about tonight is, I want to show you a bunch of numbers to show you exactly what is the nature of the problem, what's the magnitude. I want to help try to understand what's the source of the problem. What is it that's driving this fiscal train wreck that we see coming down the train tracks? And I want to talk a little bit about why it's potentially so detrimental to the performance of our economy. And after doing that, what I'll do is I'll try to have a little bit of a discussion of what we could do to avert the train wreck. Okay, so what are the policy options? And what I'll do at the end, in closing, is I'll try to address a question that's received quite a bit of attention in Europe recently. We've seen several countries in Europe having difficulties with their budgets. And for example, in Greece, we saw that they actually had to default on their debt. And we've seen countries like Ireland and Spain, Italy, also run into some situations where it's not clear that people want to lend to these governments anymore. And it's natural to ask, at what point would the U.S. arrive to that situation? At what point would a really bleak fiscal situation lead potentially to a default or to a sovereign debt crisis? Okay, so that's what I hope to end up with. So I'm going to speak for maybe 35 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. So if questions pop into your head as we move along, take note of it, and I'll be happy to answer them. I always really enjoy the question and answer part of these gatherings. Okay, so let's move past the joke. Let's look at the debt. So remember, what we were just looking at there was a picture about the deficit. The deficit is the annual amount that the government has to borrow each year, right? So if the government spends $2 trillion, but only brings in $1 trillion of revenue, it's got to borrow $1 trillion to make up that deficit. All those borrowings from past deficits accumulate over time, and that's what gives us our debt. And so we can take a look at what our nation's debt has been throughout history. And so these are figures that are taken from the Congressional Budget Office. It's a nonpartisan branch of government. Just its role is to kind of keep track of the numbers on these things. And I should note, what's on the vertical axis here is the debt expressed as a percentage of our gross domestic product. So as a percentage of the amount of stuff that our economy produces each year. And that's a natural benchmark, just, it gives us something to compare it to. So what you see is that early in our nation's history, we had a pretty high debt to GDP ratio. It was maybe 35%, as you would expect, having just come out of a Revolutionary War, right? The government had to borrow a lot of money to finance the war. But over time, that debt was paid off, and it actually was paid off completely at one point. And then another war rolls around. The government accumulates a lot more debt, but once the war ends, the debt is paid down. We see something similar in World War I, World War II. World War II was really just a tremendous undertaking from the perspective of the federal government. I think at the peak of the war, the federal government was spending 45% of the country's income on the war effort. Okay, but they weren't able to bring in that much in tax revenue, and so clearly they had to borrow. And that borrowing added up quickly. And you could see by the end of the war, the debt to GDP ratio, the debt expressed as a fraction of GDP, was about 100%. Okay? So just as a point of comparison, anybody have any idea what the debt to GDP ratio was in Greece when they had to default? 100, 120, so not so different from where we were at the end of World War II. Now, of course, there was no fear that the U.S. was going to default because people realized the war was going to end and then they'd be able to pay it down, whereas in Greece, there was kind of no fix in sight. But, when the war ended, the debt was paid down again until, Vietnam came along and started growing again, and then the Cold War added quite a bit to, the Reagan defense buildup added to the national debt. But even after that, once the Cold War ended, the debt started to decline as a fraction of GDP. And now we see the most recent episode. Okay, so this run up here is a result of the economic crisis. The deficits that the country has run really in the last 4 years were at a level that we haven't seen really since World War II. Okay, and so the debt has added up quickly. Again, none of this would be of concern if what was driving the current situation was really short-run in nature. And to some extent, that's true. It's caused by the current economic crisis. But unfortunately, when the Congressional Budget Office projects out where this is going to go, even once the economy recovers, what you see is this path here. And so you see that by, say, 2038, or I think it's 2040, the debt to GDP ratio is projected to be where it was at the end of World War II. And if you were to project this out farther, it just keeps going up and up and up. Okay, so this has nothing to do with any war. It has nothing to do with any economic crisis. It really has to do with a crisis of leadership in Washington. It has to do with kind of a broken system in Washington. And we'll talk about that when we try to understand what we can do to avert this train wreck that you see here. Okay, because that's clearly headed toward levels that caused Greece to default. Okay. So you might wonder, well, is it taxes or is it spending that have changed so much to kind of in recent years that have led to this run up? And then you could also ask, projecting forward, is it that tax revenues are expected to fall, or is it that expenditures by the government are expected to rise so much? And that's what this figure here shows. And so the light blue color, those are expenditures. That's the fraction of our nation's income, or GDP, that the government spends each year. And so it goes up and down. We have recessions, we have wars, we have tax cuts. The dark blue line here is revenues. And so you see that for most of the time period that we're looking at here, the government has run deficits. They've spent more than they brought in. But we're talking maybe 2-3% of GDP. The deficits weren't huge. In the current economic crisis that we've just kind of gone through, you can see that the deficit exploded. It was a 10 or 11% of GDP, really unprecedented levels. But more on point for tonight's talk is the question of kind of where we're going. Okay, and you can see that in the next, I guess that goes out to 2020, so just over the next 6-7 years, both spending and expenditures under current policy are expected to go up. Okay, and the gap between the two is not so inordinate, relative to things that we've seen in the past. But what we're going to see in some of the next slides is that when you project out farther, the gap really grows. Okay, and it grows while both revenues and expenditures are growing. So it's not that tax revenues are falling dramatically. In fact, they're going to be growing over time, but they're just not going to be growing fast enough to keep up with expenditures. And we want to dig down a little bit and try to understand which expenditures are we expecting to grow so much? Which expenditures are contributing to this train wreck? Okay, so before we kind of dig deeper on some of those numbers, let's pause for a moment and try to understand, why does this matter so much? Why is it that a growing federal debt can be so bad for the economy? We already mentioned the potential for a sovereign debt crisis, or for sovereign debt default, like Greece had. We know we don't want to do that. But short of that, accumulating a debt like this can have really adverse consequences for the economy. And this is Econ 101. This is not complicated stuff. This is going to be stuff you already understand. So one of the reasons that it's so bad for the government to have to borrow so much is that when the government's borrowing in credit markets, that means that there's less funds available for private companies to borrow. And so in essence, there's going to be less investment in factories, in productive capacity, because firms don't have as much available to them to borrow. And clearly that's bad. That's going to mean that our economy doesn't grow as fast. And so you're going to have a growing debt, and the economy itself is not going to be growing as fast, and both are going to contribute to the debt to GDP ratio rising. A second adverse consequence of this growing federal debt is, and this is a little bit difficult to see sometimes, but it actually contributes to our growing trade deficits. Basically, when our government is spending so much, it leads our country to spend more as a whole than we actually produce. And what makes up the difference is basically imports. And so the way it works out is, if you look over history, typically when the government runs big deficits in terms of the fiscal situation, the country as a whole tends to run a trade deficit. And the third factor that we need to think about is, as I've already mentioned, is we could end up with a fiscal crisis like we've seen in Greece, Argentina, as there's been some concerns about in Italy and Spain. Okay, and this is just a small side note, but when actors in the economy and when all of us see these problems coming down the train tracks, we react to it today. We don't just wait for it to cause all these problems that we listed here. We can anticipate that there's going to be problems. And often the way that firms respond when they see these problems is they say, gosh, do I really want to build a new factory? Do I really want to invest more when I know that the government's going to be taxing more, that the economy is going to be slowing down due to these problems? And so there's some economists believe that really part of the problem that we're having now in terms of the weak recovery from this economic crisis can be traced to this really dire situation that we see down the road. There's just not a lot of reason to have confidence in the economy looking out 5, 10, 15 years. And that feeds back into what we see happening today. Okay, so let's start to dig into the numbers a little bit more. Let's try to understand what is it that's causing this bleak picture as we look out farther down the road? So the first figure here, again, the dotted line here is basically the dividing line between history and what the Congressional Budget Office is projecting based on current policy. And this is really just a recap of what we saw on that first figure. Well, not the cartoon, but the first real figure. Right? We see the debt growing to basically 100% of GDP by 2038. The second figure here breaks it down into spending and revenues. Okay, so this is what they project to happen to spending and revenues. And again, as we saw in that other figure, the two really diverged in the recent economic crisis. They come back together a little bit, and so the deficit has been shrinking, actually. I think it's down to $700 billion or something. But the problem lies in these out years, where the two lines really start to diverge. And it may not look too radical. I mean, they're diverging, but it's not crazy. But the problem is that the more they diverge, the more the debt's going to accumulate. The bigger the deficit's going to be each year, and as we run bigger deficits, it accumulates into a greater debt. Now, hopefully everyone here can see the bottom panel, because this is really the one that's of greatest interest to us. It really helps us to start to understand what it is that's driving the situation. Okay, so this is basically going to break down the different components of spending. Why is it that we saw here that spending's expected to grow from, historically it's been averaging at about 20% of GDP. It's expected to grow up to about 26% within the next 25 years or so. Which component of spending is it that's going to grow so much? Well, let's start with the yellow line here. This is interest. So this is the interest that the government has to pay on the existing debt. And it shouldn't be surprising that as the debt grows, the interest that the government has to pay is going to grow as well. And so it's going to grow from maybe 2% of GDP to 4 or maybe even 5%. So it's not trivial. And to the extent that we're able to fix this problem sooner, then the debt won't build as much and we won't have that interest. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, that the quicker we can tackle this problem, the easier it's going to be to do so. But this one's not really the most interesting one, I don't think. These two here are, but let's skip those for a moment. Let's just focus on the blue. The blue is kind of everything you think of the government doing. Okay, it's the military, it's paying for federal workers, federal highways, federal research programs. It's basically everything you think of as the government is doing. That's not actually growing, right? That starts at about 6-7%, and it's going to end here at about 7%. So what that suggests is that it's going to be these other two components here. And so what are those? Well, those are entitlements. This is where we start to see the problems. So the gray line down here is Social Security. You can see that back in 2000, the country spent about 4% of GDP as transfer payments, Social Security payments to retired people. That's expected to grow to 6%. So again, that's not crazy. That's an increase of about 2% of GDP. The green line here is where we really start to see the problem. That starts out at 3%. It ends up at 8%. And the green line, as you can see, hopefully, this is federal spending on major health care programs. So that's Medicare, Medicaid, the new insurance exchanges associated with Obamacare, if those ever get working, and the Children's Health Insurance Program. So there's really 4 main components there. And that's projected to grow really rapidly. And so
the military?
No, the military is going to fall in kind of all this one here, other non-interest spending.
Even the military health care is separate?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure where they put the military health care. I'm not quite sure. My guess is it's a pretty small component overall, so whether they include it here or here is not going to make too big of a difference. Good question, then. Okay, so we're going to have to start to understand really what's driving this increase. And once you understand what's driving it, we can hopefully come up with some solutions to how to get that to not grow so fast. So this is kind of digging in deeper on that medical component of federal expenditures, and it's showing you these different programs. So you can see that Medicare is a big component, right? It's growing from 2% of GDP in 2000 to about 5% in 25 years from now. And then you see that these other programs, they grow as well, but it's really Medicare is the biggest component of that growth. So why is this? What is it about medical expenditures by the government that's going to grow so much over the next 25 years? Baby boomers. That's part of it. So that you predicted my next slide here. So there's the changing demographics of our country, right? A lot of people baby boomers, who have been working over the last 30 years, who've been paying into these programs, are now going to be retiring, and they're going to start receiving benefits from these programs. And so what we see here, it's a very boring figure, but we see the fraction of the population, or the part of the population is 65 or older, as a percentage of basically the working population. So how many retirees do we have per working person, basically? And you can see that it's going to grow from basically one retiree per every 5 workers to one retiree for every 2.5 or 3 workers. That's a pretty radical change. I guess we're going to have a lot more people receiving Social Security and Medicare. But that's not all of it, right? Because we saw, if you just go back, it's not just Medicare, right? Medicare is the only one that's associated with retirees, right? These are, Medicaid is for low-income, children's health insurance is in some sense for low-income families, and the exchange subsidies are independent of age. Okay, and they're growing from maybe 2% to about 4%. So it's not just the demographic changes that the country's experiencing. So what else is it? Healthcare is just becoming more expensive. And I guess I wish I had been here for this symposium that was here last week, because I would have liked to understand healthcare better myself. It's kind of the million-dollar question, is how to fix healthcare. So what this figure shows is that the effect of aging alone, the demographic problem, is going to contribute a little bit to it. So this is just kind of showing what percentage of GDP, the change in debt as a fraction of GDP, can be accounted for by that aging of the population. And it's not so huge. This is much bigger, and this is basically just the fact that healthcare is becoming more expensive relative to everything else that we buy. Okay. Now, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's just as a society we decide we're richer and we decide that we want to spend more on healthcare, and these health procedures that we get, they're great. A lot of them are effective, but they're very expensive. And we haven't really found a way to control the costs on the medical costs that the government has to pay. Now, this area in the middle here, that reflects the fact that these two effects really feed off of each other. They reinforce each other. Not only you're having more people, more retirees, but they're actually, all their medical expenditures are becoming more expensive. Okay, so they reinforce each other. And so that's why, so maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, but we're looking at a different time scale here. So this is looking way out into the future. Okay, this is looking way out to 2082. So this is kind of the 25-year time frame we were looking at before. But as this indicates, it just keeps growing and growing unless we change policy, or unless we're able to get medical costs to grow at a slower rate. Okay, so how do we fix this? In some sense, it's really easy. As an economist, it's simple. I mean, if you make me dictator for a day, I fix it. Okay? The difficulties, of course, become that everything that I, as an economist, am going to prescribe is going to be pretty painful. Okay? There's one exception, so we'll start with the happy one. Okay? How do you fix the problem? Well, make GDP grow faster. Right? We're talking about the debt to GDP ratio. Well, if you make the bottom thing grow faster, the whole thing's going to shrink. Okay? Problem is, there's no magic switch to do that. There's no magic policy to get the economy to grow faster. You can tinker at the margins, you can reform the tax code, you can change people's incentives to work or to invest, but there's not a lot of room there to do that. If it were that easy, we would have done it already, right? So it'd be nice, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We can make more investments in R&D so that we innovate more, and do the types of things that make the economy grow faster. Reform the tax code, maybe. Okay, but at the end of the day, that's not going to get us very far. There's not a lot of low-hanging fruit there. Okay, so that was a happy one, but it's happy but not very feasible. The next two are not so happy, and they're obvious. I'm not going to surprise you with anything here, right? You've either got to raise taxes, or you got to cut spending. It's pretty. Budget arithmetic is simple. The amount of money coming in has got to be pretty similar to the amount of money that's going out. And the way you get the amount of money to coming in to grow is to raise taxes. Now, there's a million questions about which taxes on whom. And those are good debates to have. Some taxes are more efficient to raise than others, but they're all painful. No one likes to pay taxes. And same kind of goes for spending. I guess everyone likes spending, because if the government spends less, sometimes politicians don't get reelected. So it must be that people kind of vote for them to keep spending on their projects. It's kind of bleak, okay? If we really had to, if we had to focus all of our energies on one area, as the previous slides indicated, the area that you'd want to focus on is healthcare costs. We've got to find a way to reduce the growth of medical costs. Either the costs per procedure, per doctor's visit, or somehow reduce the number of procedures and reduce the number of doctor visits. And you might think, well, didn't we just have this huge national debate over healthcare over the last 4 years, and aren't we still having it? Isn't the government on the case? Maybe it's not working out, but at least they're trying to do something about it. All those numbers that we've seen are based on current policy. They're based on the policies that we currently have. So none of these changes that we've seen over the last 4 years have really done anything to put much of a dent into the cost problem. In some sense, you could argue that some of the reforms that we've had are going to actually increase expenditures on medical costs, because basically a lot more people are going to have insurance, and a lot more people are going to be going to the doctor, and that's not going to drive costs down. It's going to drive it up, if anything. Okay, so, I can back up a minute. I wish I could give kind of a rosy scenario where there's a clear path forward, that we can see that the government's actually going to tackle this problem. But if you turn on the news at all, you see that there's a lot of dysfunction in Washington, D.C. The two sides don't really talk to each other. They kind of scream at each other. There have been a few bipartisan commissions that have come together to try to come up with a proposal for how to get the government's fiscal situation in order. So I think it was called the Simpson-Bowles Commission was put together about 4 years ago. They came up with a proposal. It was actually a very interesting proposal. It was a bipartisan proposal, right? Simpson was a Republican, Bowles was a Democrat. I don't know all the details of that proposal. Probably none of you do either, because it never really got any traction. No one really paid it much attention. But I can tell you some of the ingredients that were in there. One was changing the way that we index Social Security payments. So currently, Social Security payments increase every year with inflation. And there's most economists really believe that our measures of inflation kind of overstate the case. And so as a result, Social Security payments grow a little bit too fast. So that was one of the recommendations. Another, I think, was to raise the retirement age. So currently the retirement age for Social Security and Medicare is increasing from 65 to 67 very gradually. I think the recommendation there was to increase it from 67 to 69. Seems really sensible. Okay, why? Well, if people have to work 2 more years, that's basically like raising taxes. That's 2 more years that you're paying into the system. and it's 2 fewer years that you're receiving benefits from the system. And that makes a huge difference. I mean, that one change would really actually put quite a big dent into the problem. And my guess, if I had to kind of predict, one day when the solution is actually put in place, and I think it will be, usually the country comes together when the situation gets really dire. I think when a fix is finally put in place, that'll be a big component of it, is raising the retirement age. Okay, let's go back to this question that we mentioned at the beginning. How am I doing for time? Okay, so we saw, what was it, about a year ago, that Greece defaulted on their debt. Basically, what did they pay? Maybe 40 cents on the dollar for their existing debt. So anyone who's holding Greek debt, that was a bad deal. And as someone pointed out, their debt to GDP ratio had gotten a little bit above where it was in the U.S. at the end of World War II. It had gotten to about 120%. But it had gotten to 120%, and the level of dysfunction in their government makes our government look like, they couldn't come up with any solution. And so investors, let's talk about how does a sovereign debt default work, basically, or a sovereign debt crisis. It's pretty basic economics. Investors have to buy this debt, especially if the debt frequently has to be rolled over. And so if you're an investor, whether you're a bank or a private investor, and you're trying to think, do I want to invest in some Greek debt? You're not going to do that without looking into the government's finances in Greece. And so you look into it and you're like, that's kind of scary. And so basically you say, I'm not going to hold that debt unless that debt pays me really high interest rate, 10, 12, 15% per year. Right? What do treasuries, 10-year treasuries in the U.S. pay now? About 2.5%? 2.7. Okay, Greek debt was 10, 12, 15%. And when the interest gets that high, what happens? Well, the debt grows even faster. Right? They've got to borrow just to pay the interest on the debt. And so you can see how a situation like that would quickly spiral out of control. Because as the interest payments rise, the debt gets worse, and investors become even more scared. And they say, no, 15% is not going to cut it. You want me to hold that debt to take on the risk that you're not actually going to repay me? I want 25%. Okay? And it gets to the point where they just throw up their hands and they say, we can't pay the debt. And then they renegotiate, and that's why they paid like 40 cents on the dollar. This has played out in many countries. It played out in Argentina not so many years ago. If I had to guess, it'll happen in Spain or Italy in the next 5 to 10 years. Because basically the way they've been solving it, dealing with the situation in Europe is just kick the can down the road. They've had the European Central Bank become the investor that holds the debt. And they don't have to worry about, default and so forth. So they don't drive up the interest rates. So that's how it played out in Greece. That's how it's played out in many countries throughout history. At what point would it get to that situation for the U.S.? As we just said, currently, interest rates on the federal debt are really at an all-time low. 2.7% on 10-year debt is amazingly low. So people see the train wreck that's coming, but it's not scaring them yet. Okay, so I guess if you wanted to take one little bit of optimism away from the talk tonight, it's that someone out there, someone in the markets thinks the situation is not that bad because they're lending to the government at 2.7%. They don't see a lot of default risk, at least yet. But we saw that the numbers there, they're really starting to, 5, 10 years, 15 years from now, they'll be in the territory where 100%, 110%, 120%. In the realm, in the territory of where Greece ran into trouble. So a natural question to ask is there a magic number? Is there a number at which, when a country gets to a debt to GDP ratio of, say, 120%, do they default? No, there's no magic number. It's really hard to predict these types of things. Partly because these things are really based on where do investors see things going farther into the future. right? At the end of World War II, we were at 100%, and people said, well, that's no problem. The war's going to end, and they'll pay it down. So there's no risk of default. I mean, to give an interesting point of comparison, does anyone know what the debt to GDP ratio is in Japan currently?
200.
It's a very informed crowd. That's right, 200%. So they're way past the point at which Greece ran into trouble. They've really done some big time borrowing. And their demographic problem makes ours look simple. Right? They're very much an aging population. So a lot of the problems that we see in the U.S. I didn't mean to go forward. Well, a lot of the problems that we see in the U.S. they've got much bigger problems in Japan. So how is it the case? Why is it that Japan can have a debt to GDP ratio of 200%, a more dire situation going forward, and yet investors aren't scared?
The debt is held in currency.
They print their own currency.
So those are some of the answers you hear out there. They print their own currency, the debt's held internally. I don't know. I don't find those always very convincing. I mean, to me, it's a mystery. I mean, no one's forcing those internal investors to hold the debt, right?
Well, they have no investment alternative as a domestic Japanese saver.
I'd rather hold cash than hold something that I think the government won't repay.
So then who buys the debt? The banks buy the debt because they have to have something on their balance sheet.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know enough to.
The external debt holding of Japanese investors is less than 2%.
Yeah, no,
90% of Japanese government debt is held in currency.
Yeah, I guess I don't know enough about Japan. It'd still be the case, though. That are they forcing these banks to hold the debt? Maybe that's the case. Maybe they just don't have alternatives.
But the banks have nobody else to lend to.
Yeah.
So they have oceans of deposits. So to cover that, what do they buy?
Yeah. But it's an interesting question, though. You know, at what point is the U.S. going to run in? At what point is the train going to crash? And no one really knows. You know, in Argentina, actually, the debt to GDP ratio was much lower. It was like 60 or 70%. But again, they saw a problem down the road where it was going to go from 60 or 70% to over 100%, and they said, I don't want anything to do with this debt at all. They got scared much sooner.
So it's not percentage as much as it's a crisis of confidence.
Well, it's a combination of the two, right? It's what's the percentage, where are we now, and where do we see things going in the future? And so that's the sense in which, you know, the country, the United States, now has a window of maybe 5, 10, 15 years to get the situation under control. Because that's the nature of these sovereign debt crises. You never know when it's going to happen until it happens, and then it's too late. Because they spiral out of control so quickly. And so we really have a window of 5, 10, 15 years to get this under control. And it's really important that we do it sooner rather than later. We saw that before. We saw the interest on the debt growing so much. Okay? If we can get the debt to stabilize or to actually start to shrink, that interest won't grow as much. But it's really important, actually, for another reason, that we address this in 5 to 10 to 15 years, and really it's a matter of justice. Okay, so many of these debates about the debt and the deficit and the debt ceiling and sequestration, they're really debates about, well, are the rich going to pay more? Are we going to cut spending that helps the less fortunate? And all of those debates are cast in terms of kind of the well-to-do today versus the not-so-well-to-do today. But really, that's all valid, and that's worth having a debate about. But what gets lost in that picture is the question of justice about today's generations versus future generations. Right? Today's generations are basically leaving a real mess for future generations. Future generations are going to inherit this tremendous tax burden. One way or another, whether it's cutting spending or increasing taxes, and it's at the end of the day going to have to be a combination of the two. It's not very fun, as we talked about. Those are not very palatable policies. And that's what our policies today are burdening the next generation with. And that's really a great injustice. And so, you know, hopefully our politicians get serious about this. I think they will. I think at some point a leader will step forward who will be credible, who can bring people together, and who can make the country face the tough choices. I don't know who that'll be, but it's got to be out there somewhere. Maybe one of the students in the crowd here.